For more than a decade, one dam has dominated the relationship between Egypt and Ethiopia, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, GERD. But in August 2026, the Nile debate is entering a new phase. Egypt is raising concerns over plans for additional Ethiopian Nile projects. Ethiopia continues to defend its right to develop its water and energy resources, and Washington is showing renewed interest in diplomatic engagement. The question is no longer simply, what happens with GERD? It is becoming, who will shape the future of the Nile? Because behind the water debate is a much larger story: electricity, economic development, national sovereignty, regional partnerships, and influence across Northeast Africa. GERD may have changed the Nile equation, but the future of the river could depend on what happens next. The easiest way to understand the Nile debate is to look at the map. The river connects three countries at the center of this story: Ethiopia, Sudan, Egypt. For Ethiopia, the Blue Nile begins in its highlands. That water represents enormous potential for hydropower and economic development. For Sudan, the river supports agriculture, electricity generation, and water management. And for Egypt, the Nile is fundamental to the country's economy and society. Much of Egypt's population and economic activity is concentrated along the river. So when Ethiopia develops a major project upstream, Egypt looks beyond the electricity generation. It considers how the project could affect the wider river system. That is why the debate has become so important. Egypt emphasizes water security. Ethiopia emphasizes development and sovereignty, and these priorities now need to be balanced. But today's Nile debate didn't begin with the GERD. Its roots go back more than a century. One of the most debated parts of the story involves historical Nile agreements. In 1929, Britain reached an agreement concerning Nile waters involving Egypt and territories under British control. Ethiopia was not a party. Then came the 1959 agreement between Egypt and Sudan. Again, Ethiopia was not a signatory. For Egypt, historical agreements and long-standing water use are important parts of its position. For Ethiopia, those agreements cannot permanently determine the rights of an upstream country that was not included in key arrangements. And this creates a fundamental difference in perspective. Egypt asks, how can the water security of millions of people be protected without clear rules? Ethiopia asks, how can historical agreements permanently limit the development of an upstream country? That historical disagreement helped shape the modern Nile debate. And then, in 2011, everything changed. In 2011, Ethiopia announced the construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. The location was strategic. The dam was built on the Blue Nile, upstream from Sudan and Egypt, and its primary purpose was clear: hydropower. GERD was designed with an installed capacity of roughly 550 megawatts. Its reservoir holds roughly 74 billion cubic meters of water. But GERD became much more than an engineering project. In Ethiopia, it became a national symbol, a symbol of self-reliance, a symbol of development, and a demonstration of Ethiopia's ambition to expand its energy capacity. For Egypt, however, GERD created a different set of questions, because the issue wasn't simply, how much electricity will Ethiopia generate? The question became, how will the dam be managed during periods of limited rainfall? Here's where the discussion becomes complicated. During normal years, cooperation may be relatively manageable. But what happens during a prolonged drought? Imagine Ethiopia needs water management that allows GERD to continue producing electricity. At the same time, Egypt needs sufficient water downstream. Sudan has its own agricultural and water management requirements. Now the challenge becomes, how much water should be released? When? And according to what rules? Egypt has repeatedly supported legally binding arrangements governing GERD operations, particularly during periods of drought. Ethiopia has favored arrangements that preserve flexibility for its own water and energy development. So the disagreement is not simply about the amount of water. It is also about the rules governing shared resources. And that distinction is important, because a dam can generate electricity, but the rules surrounding that dam can shape regional relationships. For Ethiopia, GERD could transform the country's energy system. Reliable electricity can power factories, it can support digital infrastructure, it can expand manufacturing, and surplus electricity can potentially be exported to neighboring countries. That changes Ethiopia's regional position, because electricity creates connections. A country that supplies power to its neighbors develops economic relationships, and economic relationships can create diplomatic influence. This is why this story is bigger than GERD. The wider question is how water infrastructure can support Ethiopia's economic transformation. Now we reach the newest chapter. In August 2026, Egypt has raised concerns over additional Ethiopian Nile projects. Egypt has emphasized the importance of coordinated management of Nile flows. Ethiopia continues to emphasize its right to develop its water and energy resources. The debate has therefore moved beyond the original construction of GERD. It is increasingly about what Ethiopia's next phase of infrastructure development could look like. Think about the long-term implications. If GERD changed the Nile equation once, what happens as Ethiopia develops more energy infrastructure? From Cairo's perspective, that could create a new water management reality. From Addis Abeba's perspective, GERD cannot represent the end of Ethiopia's development ambitions, and this is where finding durable rules becomes increasingly important. For Egypt, the Nile is not an ordinary resource. It is central to national water security. Egypt relies overwhelmingly on the Nile for its freshwater resources. That means Cairo closely follows developments upstream. Egypt has also expressed strong concerns about additional Ethiopian projects and their potential impact on Nile flows. This does not mean a regional crisis is inevitable, but it demonstrates how important the issue has become for Egypt. From Cairo's perspective, the long-term concern is a future in which upstream infrastructure becomes increasingly important to Nile management, while downstream countries seek greater predictability and coordination. That is the central concern. But Ethiopia has its own priorities: sovereignty, development, and energy access. Ethiopia is one of Africa's most important countries. It has a large population, enormous hydropower potential, and a strong desire to industrialize. For Addis Ababa, placing permanent limits on development could restrict the country's economic potential. The Ethiopian argument is essentially, why should a country remain energy poor when it possesses enormous renewable resources? There is also a broader principle. The Nile is a shared international river. Ethiopia argues that upstream countries have legitimate rights to use shared water resources while considering the interests of downstream countries. That makes the debate much larger than GERD. It becomes a discussion about how international rivers should be managed in the modern era. Then there is Sudan, the country between Ethiopia and Egypt. And Sudan has something neither side can ignore: geography. GERD could provide Sudan with important benefits: more regulated flows, potential flood management, and electricity. But Sudan also has its own priorities. Its dams and agricultural systems depend on predictable water management. And Sudan's internal political situation makes long-term water planning more difficult. This means the Nile debate isn't simply about two countries. Sudan has its own interests, and its relationship with both Ethiopia and Egypt could influence the future of Nile cooperation. Now zoom out even further. Because the Nile debate sits inside one of the world's most strategically important regions. Northeast Africa. Egypt sits at the northern end of the Red Sea. Ethiopia is the region's major landlocked power. Sudan has a long Red Sea coastline, and the Suez Canal connects the region to global trade. This creates an unusual intersection. Water, ports, energy, trade, infrastructure, all of them overlap. And that means the Ethiopia-Egypt relationship cannot be viewed separately from the wider economic and strategic environment of the Red Sea. The Gulf states also have major interests in this region. Over the last decade, Gulf countries have invested across Northeast Africa: ports, agriculture, logistics, energy, and infrastructure. Why? Because the Red Sea is one of the world's most important trade corridors, and Ethiopia is one of Africa's largest markets. Egypt is a major regional economy. Sudan sits directly on the Red Sea. So stability and economic development across these countries matter far beyond the Nile basin. The more interconnected the economies become, the more international the Nile debate becomes. And now, Washington is returning to the picture. The United States has shown renewed interest in diplomatic engagement between Egypt and Ethiopia over the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam and Nile water management. That is significant because Washington has previously been involved in efforts to facilitate dialogue. Now, the Trump administration is again showing interest in the issue. But the United States faces a delicate balancing act. Egypt is strategically important. Ethiopia is strategically important. And stability around the Red Sea matters globally. A successful agreement would need to address the central challenge. How can Ethiopia continue developing its water and energy resources while giving Egypt and Sudan greater confidence during periods of limited rainfall? That is the difficult question, and it remains unresolved. So what happens next? The answer may depend partly on the wider geopolitical environment. The United States wants regional stability. China is deeply involved in African infrastructure. Russia is expanding relationships across parts of Africa. Gulf powers are investing in ports and logistics. Egypt is strengthening regional partnerships, and Ethiopia is pursuing its own strategic agenda. The result is a region where infrastructure can become diplomacy. Energy can create economic connections. Ports can become strategic assets. And water can become a central part of national development. This doesn't have to produce confrontation. It can also create incentives for cooperation. The first possibility is cooperation. A comprehensive framework could establish arrangements for periods of drought. Data could be shared. Dam operations could become more transparent. Ethiopia could continue generating electricity. Egypt could receive greater predictability. Sudan could protect its own interests. This is the most positive scenario, but it requires something that has been difficult to build: trust. The second possibility is a prolonged disagreement. No comprehensive agreement, but no major regional crisis either. The dam continues operating. Ethiopia continues developing. Egypt continues seeking stronger guarantees. Sudan continues balancing its own interests. And negotiations continue over the years. The Nile remains one of the region's most important diplomatic issues. The third possibility is the one everyone wants to avoid: a serious deterioration in relations, a major diplomatic breakdown, or a regional crisis connected to wider developments. The consequences would be significant for Ethiopia, for Egypt, for Sudan, and for millions of people who depend on the Nile. That is why sustained dialogue remains so important. Because once cooperation breaks down around a shared river, finding a solution becomes much harder. Ultimately, Egypt and Ethiopia face the same reality. They cannot move the Nile, they cannot change geography, and neither can simply ignore the other country's interests. Egypt needs water security. Ethiopia needs development. Sudan needs stability. So the real challenge is not deciding who owns the river. It is creating rules for managing a shared resource. Because during normal years, cooperation can be relatively easy. The real test comes during periods of limited water, when electricity demand rises, when agriculture needs more, and when governments face pressure at home. That is when agreements matter most. GERD changed the Nile equation. But the story didn't end with the dam. In many ways, that was when the next chapter began, because Ethiopia now has a powerful symbol of its development ambitions. Egypt faces a future in which upstream infrastructure is becoming increasingly important. Sudan remains an essential part of the equation, and outside powers are watching closely. So the question is no longer simply, what happens with GERD? The bigger question is, who will shape the rules of the Nile in the decades ahead? Will Ethiopia emerge as a regional energy powerhouse? Will Egypt preserve its historic influence over the river? Will Sudan become a bridge for cooperation? And can diplomacy create a framework that allows development and water security to exist together? Because this isn't just a story about water. It's a story about development, about sovereignty, about energy, and about the future of Northeast Africa. GERD may have changed the Nile forever, but the next chapter will be written through the choices made by Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan.